conceived in stain, your word from your translation. So you are conceived in physical stain because you were conceived in coitus. And my presentation several weeks ago was basically showing that everything that is in Augustine's sermons can be found in about 6 previous sermons in the Latin West for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. That's what's very interesting. The point is not that there's a philological link, like we can't find Palamas quoting verbatim in Greek, following the Latin syntax or following a Latin translation. But what we can do is the discussion of Psalm 50, the discussion of Mary with regard to Psalm 50 being born and conceived in original sin, the exemption of Mary's physical line because of Joachim and Anna reproducing Mary without passion and coitus, are all the traditional ways that sermons in England, before the university sermons in Paris, sermons in England primitively argued the Immaculate Conception. So we're talking about the time of St. Anselm to about the mid-13th century. If you were going to argue for the Immaculate Conception in the West, you would argue what is called the active conception of Anna. The physical act of sperm and egg coming together is the concentration of Immaculate Conception talk, not Mary's reception of a justified soul, of a sanctified soul. You see the difference here is about the physical material being impure, not about whether or not the soul was created in original justice. Duns Scotus changes the the optics on this, so that the major argument for the Immaculate Conception is that Mary was infused with a fully justified or sanctified soul, and he considers it a red herring to talk about physical stain since it's a metaphor. That is certainly possible in the patristic literature. It may be a metaphor in the patristic literature, but they're too ambiguous. We can't tease out what part is merely metaphor and what part might be taken literally. Scotus finally just says, look, now we do have John Damascene that does this, though. John Damascene does refer one time in one of his works, which I quote in the article that William has linked us to, which is after my Immaculate Conception book. John Damascene really doubles down that in the most literal sense, sin is always about the will. It's never about flesh or bodies or physicality. If there's anything that's called sin in its literal sense, not in a figurative or metaphorical sense, it is when the will is malicious. And therefore, for John Damascene, he represents an Eastern teaching that, literally speaking, original sin cannot be in the body, because it is purely a matter of malice of the will. So there must be some effect on the will that constitutes original sin. And of course, Scotus is the culmination of this by saying, using St. Anselm, saying, yeah, it's called original justice. Either you're infused with original justice, as Anselm keys us into, or you're not at conception. And Mary was, and that's the terms of the debate. So this gets us back to the Palamas quote that you're giving us. I mean, there's so much there. Palamas is dealing with an Eastern patristic metaphor, which would have been at least familiar enough where he didn't have to spend a lot of time explaining it. However, the flavor of his sermon is entirely Western. It's Psalm 50, which Easterners do not use in their discussions of Mary and sin. The gospel is Matthew chapter 1, which is the gospel used for almost all the Immaculate Conception festal literature from the 13th century all the way up until the new offices of the Immaculate Conception in the 15th century. So when look what the comments are rather unusual. You're reading from his citation, which is from the entry homily, the entry of the Theotokos. The other time that he mentions this is the Advent homily for the Sunday of the Forefathers, which is the book of Matthew, chapter 1, just like the readings for Immaculate Conception in the West. So why is Palamas innovatively commenting on the Sunday of the Forefathers about Mary's conception by purified seed? Because he has a context for doing this, and that is, we don't know if it's the local English monasteries that are around the area that have translated something into Greek devotionally. We don't know if it's maybe the Franciscans who have translated some texts. But he's gotten a hold of something which we can't find any parallels in Greek literature. So Francis Dvornik, a very famous name, as well as Martin Gigi, another famous name, drew attention to the fact that Palamas's doctrine of the purification of the physical seed gradually over time from Adam or Abraham all the way to Joachim is unique to Palamas in Byzantine liturgy, in Byzantine literature. You won't find it anywhere. But where will you find it? You'll find 6 sermons that predate Palamas that have this exact argumentation in the Latin West. And probably the one that the sermon that Palamas parallels the most, almost tit for tat, is a sermon that is attributed to the Englishman, or rather the Frenchman, Peter Cantor. But in fact, it's a pseudo Peter Cantor, so it's an anonymous sermon. So what's new with this pre-purified stuff? Well, this is new, that we can contextualize Palamas's sermons when they speak about the purification of the line of Mary, that these exact arguments going generation to generation and talking about a gradual selection, purification, and elevation of the ancestral seed of Mary is a theme that was already brought up by Western authors in Western Immaculate Conception sermons. What is interesting, this is the thing that I cannot resolve, is what do we do with the fact that the birthday homily of that is attributed to John Damascene looks like it could be the first source for this kind of thinking. So does the scenario maybe look something like this? There was a Greek homily, first millennium or second millennium, that first drew attention to the fact that if Joachim's seed was all pure, and the actual technical language that Joachim's seed in John Damascene's birthday homily says is that he ejaculated clean seed. He's using Galenic medical terminology there, but he puts a bit of a religious spin on it, so you don't think that it's to be taken in absolute medical terms. In the medical literature, it's amomon sperma, and John Damascene says pan-amomon spermen, which means to give it a universal purity, not just a medical purity, right? So when he does this, let's say that this is a 13th century Greek homily, or maybe a 12th century Greek homily. I wonder if it somehow made it to England, because we have evidence of Greeks making it to England that are influencing the Feast of the Immaculate Conception in England in the 11th century. So the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is definitely from the Greek East. They would have called it at that time the Conception of Anna, right? However, the homily attributed to John Damascene, if it was written, it could have been written at latest, let's say, 12th century. That could have been the theology that accompanied it. This is a guesswork. This is entirely speculative. It needs to be shown through historical sources. But it is potentially possible that the reading of the conception of Mary as the all pure seed of Joachim, and therefore the immaculate physical conception of Anna, was in fact a Greek sermon that inspired the English homilies from the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries that spread throughout Europe. Eventually, these homilies get translated back into Greek, and they actually inspired Gregory Palamas.